The wire cutters gleamed in the moonlight as they sliced through the final strand of fence. 3 figures dressed in HOA security uniforms worked methodically, their headlamps cutting through the darkness like predatory eyes. Behind them, the pristine suburban neighborhood of Willow Creek Estates slept peacefully, unaware of the violation taking place on its borders. "That should teach the old man," whispered Derek Matthews, the HOA president's son, as he kicked the severed fence post. The sound echoed across the vast ranch property that had stood for generations before their gated community ever existed. What they didn't know was that inside the modest ranch house, 73-year-old Samuel Washington wasn't sleeping. The decorated Vietnam veteran sat in his wheelchair by the window, watching through night vision binoculars he'd kept since his service in the Marines. His weathered hands gripped the device tighter as he witnessed the destruction of the fence his grandfather had built with his own hands in 1952. Samuel had seen this coming for months. Ever since the luxury development sprouted up around his family's 100-acre ranch, the Willow Creek HOA had made it clear they wanted him gone. They'd filed noise complaints about his roosters. They'd cited him for unsightly farm equipment visible from their pristine streets. They'd even tried to get the county to force him to connect to city water, knowing full well the cost would bankrupt him. But cutting his fence? This was an act of war. As the intruders melted back into the darkness, Samuel reached for his phone, not to call the police. He'd learned long ago that justice for a black man in this county came slowly, if at all. Instead, he scrolled through his contacts, until he found a number he hadn't called in years. Sergeant Major Rodriguez. His voice was steady, despite the rage burning in his chest. Her self-satisfied smile faltered when she noticed something strange at the ranch entrance. Where the old wooden gate had stood yesterday, there now appeared to be people. Lots of people. All wearing identical uniforms. Margaret squinted, her coffee cup freezing halfway to her lips. Those weren't just any uniforms. The distinctive woodland camouflage, the razor-sharp creases, the unmistakable bearing of professional soldiers. These were Marines, and they weren't just standing around. They were rebuilding the fence. What in God's name? Margaret breathed, her cup slipping from suddenly nerveless fingers. The porcelain shattered on her concrete driveway, but she barely noticed. Her attention was fixed on the impossible sight before her. A dozen Marines worked with military precision, their movements coordinated like a well-oiled machine. Some carried fence posts, others strung new wire, while a few stood guard with arms crossed, their steely gazes sweeping the neighborhood like sentries protecting a forward operating base. But it was the figure in the wheelchair that made Margaret's blood run cold. Samuel Washington sat at the gate, no longer the frail old man she'd been terrorizing for months. Surrounded by these warriors, he looked like what he truly was, a Marine who had earned the unbreakable loyalty of his brothers in arms. As if sensing her stare, Samuel turned his wheelchair toward the HOA president's house. Even from a distance, Margaret could see him smile. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was the smile of a man who had just revealed his ace in the hole. Her perfectly manicured hands began to shake as the full implications hit her. These weren't just any Marines helping an old veteran with his fence. The precision, the organization, the sheer number of them. This was a coordinated response. Someone with serious military connections had made a phone call.
Within an hour, every window in Willow Creek Estates had a face pressed against it. The pristine suburban paradise where the biggest excitement was usually a misplaced recycling bin had suddenly become ground zero for something none of the residents could have imagined. Margaret Pemberton paced her living room like a caged animal, her phone pressed to her ear. "What do you mean there's nothing illegal about it?" she shrieked at the county sheriff on the other end. "They're military personnel conducting operations in a civilian area." "Mom!" Sheriff Clayton's weary voice crackled through the phone. "They're veterans helping another veteran repair his fence on his own property. Last I checked, that wasn't a crime in Texas." Margaret's face flushed red. "But they're armed. Are they threatening anyone, pointing weapons, blocking public roads?" The sheriff's tone suggested he was already tired of this conversation. "Well, no, but then I suggest you worry about your own property, Mrs. Pemberton. Good day." The line went dead, leaving Margaret staring at her phone in disbelief. How had her perfectly orchestrated plan gone so wrong so quickly? Meanwhile, at the ranch, Samuel Washington was holding court like a general receiving reports from the field. The Marines had completed the fence repair in record time, but that was just the beginning. Word had spread through military networks with the speed of wildfire, and reinforcements kept arriving. Staff Sergeant Maria Santos, a 20-year veteran with 3 tours in Afghanistan, knelt beside Samuel's wheelchair. "Sir, we've got perimeter security established. Lance Corporal Johnson is documenting everything with his camera, and Gunny Martinez is reviewing local property laws to make sure we're bulletproof legally." Samuel nodded, his eyes never leaving the HOA houses visible through the trees. "What about media?" Corporal Williams has connections with the local news. One phone call, and this story goes wide. Santos paused, studying the old Marine's face. "You sure you want to escalate this, sir? Once we light this fuse, there's no going back." Samuel's weathered hands gripped his wheelchair armrests. For a moment, the tough exterior cracked, revealing the pain and exhaustion of months of harassment. "Maria, my grandfather bought this land in 1952 with money he saved, working 2 jobs after he came back from World War II. My father expanded it, worked it every day until the cancer took him. I've lived here my whole life, raised my children here, buried my wife in that cemetery on the hill." He gestured toward a small grove of oak trees where weathered headstones were barely visible. "These people think they can just push me out because I'm old, because I'm black, because I don't fit their vision of suburban perfection. But this land isn't just property to me. It's family. It's history. It's everything." Santos placed a hand on his shoulder. "Then we make our stand here, sir." As if summoned by their conversation, a black BMW pulled into the ranch driveway. The car was so pristine it looked like it had just rolled off a showroom floor. From it emerged a man in an expensive suit, his silver hair perfectly styled, his smile as sharp as a blade. "Mr. Washington!" the man called out cheerfully, apparently oblivious to the Marines positioned around the property. "I'm Robert Carlyle, from Carlyle Development Corporation. I believe you know my associate, Mrs. Pemberton." The Marine's posture shifted subtly, and Samuel noticed several hands move closer to equipment belts. These weren't active-duty soldiers, but old habits died hard. "I know who you are," Samuel replied, his voice carrying across the ranch yard with surprising strength. "You're the man trying to steal my land." Carlyle's smile never wavered, but his eyes hardened. Now, Mr. Washington, nobody's trying to steal anything. We're simply offering you a very generous price for property that, let's be honest, has become more trouble than it's worth." "Generous?" Samuel's laugh was bitter. 200,000 for 100 acres of prime land next to a luxury development, land that's worth at least 10 times that amount. Well, considering the challenges you've been facing with code violations, HOA complaints, and now this unfortunate fence incident. Carlyle let the threat hang in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. That's when Gunnery Sergeant Patricia Martinez stepped forward. At 6 feet tall, with arms like tree trunks, she had the kind of presence that could silence a room full of rowdy recruits with a single glance. Her dress blue uniform was impeccable, her medals gleaming in the Texas sun. "Excuse me," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Are you threatening this Marine veteran?" Carlyle's smile faltered for the first time. No, of course not. I'm simply discussing a business proposition. On property you don't own after your associates destroyed this man's fence in the middle of the night. Martinez stepped closer, and Carlyle instinctively backed toward his car. Sounds like intimidation to me. Now see here. No, you see here. Martinez's voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than a shout. This Marine served his country with honor. He earned the right to live in peace on his own land. Your little HOA games end now. Carlyle looked around frantically, as if searching for an escape route. The Marines formed a loose semicircle around him, not threatening, but unmistakably present. Their silence was more intimidating than any words could have been. "This isn't over," he finally managed, fumbling for his car door handle. "Yes," Samuel said quietly from his wheelchair. "It is." As Carlyle's BMW kicked up dust fleeing the ranch, Samuel felt something he hadn't experienced in months: hope. But the real confrontation was yet to come, because across the street, Margaret Pemberton was making phone calls of her own, and the war for Samuel Washington's ranch was about to escalate beyond anything Willow Creek Estates had ever seen. The Marines had won the first battle. But Margaret Pemberton hadn't built a real estate empire by backing down from fights. She had connections too, connections that reached all the way to the state capital and beyond. What she didn't realize was that when Marines said Semper Fidelis, they meant it. And Samuel Washington was about to discover just how far his brothers-in-arms would go to protect one of their own. By noon, the standoff had drawn attention from far beyond Willow Creek Estates. News vans lined the street, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky like metallic flowers seeking sun. Reporters jockeyed for position, their cameras capturing every angle of the unprecedented scene. A small army of Marines protecting an elderly veteran's ranch from suburban encroachment. Margaret Pemberton stood in her living room, watching the circus unfold through her bay window. Her phone hadn't stopped ringing, first the local news wanting comment, then state officials asking questions she couldn't answer, and finally the call that made her blood run cold. "Mrs. Pemberton?" The voice on the other end was crisp, official, terrifying in its calm professionalism. "This is Colonel Sarah Mitchell, Public Affairs Officer for the United States Marine Corps. We need to talk." Margaret's hand trembled as she gripped the phone. What about?" "About why a Marine veteran is currently under what appears to be siege in his own home, and why several news outlets are reporting that your HOA has been systematically harassing him for months." The words hit Margaret like physical blows. This was supposed to be a simple land grab, a routine intimidation of an elderly man who had no resources to fight back. How had it spiraled so far out of control? "There's been a misunderstanding," Margaret stammered. "Mr. Washington has been in violation of several community standards." "Mum," Colonel Mitchell's voice cut through her excuses like a blade through silk. "I've reviewed the complaints your HOA filed. Noise violations for roosters at 6 a.m., which is perfectly legal in your county. Citations for farm equipment being visible from the road on his own property. And last night, someone cut his fence. Would you like to explain how any of that constitutes legitimate community enforcement?" Margaret felt the walls closing in around her. We had every right to maintain community standards." "Community standards?" The Colonel's voice rose slightly, the first crack in her professional demeanor. "Mrs. Pemberton, that community was built around land that Marine's family has owned for 70 years. He was there first. Your development came to him, not the other way around." But Margaret's panic was about to get much worse, because at that moment, a sleek government sedan pulled up to Samuel's ranch, and the man who stepped out wore a uniform that made every Marine present snap to attention. Brigadier General James Washington, Samuel's nephew, though few people knew of their family connection, had flown in from Quantico the moment he received word about the situation. At 52, he commanded respect from presidents and world leaders. He also happened to be one of the most decorated black officers in Marine Corps history. The news cameras swiveled to capture his arrival, but General Washington ignored them completely. He walked directly to his uncle's wheelchair, removed his hat, and embraced the old man with tears in his eyes. "Uncle Sam," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion, "I'm sorry I wasn't here sooner." Samuel gripped his nephew's hand with surprising strength. "You're here now, Jimmy. That's what matters." The family resemblance was unmistakable once you knew to look for it. The same determined jawline, the same steady gaze, the same quiet dignity that couldn't be broken by harassment or intimidation. But where Samuel showed the wear of 7 decades and a war that had scarred a generation, James radiated the controlled power of a man at the peak of his influence. As the general stood and surveyed the scene, every Marine present seemed to grow taller. This wasn't just about helping a fellow veteran anymore. This was about protecting the family of a general who had the personal phone numbers of senators, congressmen, and the Secretary of Defense. Margaret Pemberton watched this reunion through her window, and for the first time, true fear crept into her heart. She'd been so focused on Samuel Washington, the elderly rancher, that she'd never bothered to research Samuel Washington, the man. She'd never discovered that his late wife had been a schoolteacher who'd raised successful children. She'd never learned that his son was a federal judge, his daughter a prominent civil rights attorney, and his nephew was a Marine general with enough political connections to end careers with a single phone call. Her phone rang again. This time it was Robert Carlyle, and his usual smooth confidence had been replaced by barely controlled panic. "Margaret, what the hell have you done?" His voice was sharp with fear. "Do you know who that old man is related to?" "I'm finding out," Margaret whispered, watching through her window as news crews focused their cameras on the general. "His nephew is Brigadier General James Washington. His daughter is Amanda Washington Hayes, the civil rights lawyer who just won a $50 million settlement against a housing development in Alabama. His son is Federal Judge Marcus Washington. You didn't just pick a fight with some random old veteran. You declared war on one of the most connected black families in America." Margaret's legs gave out, and she collapsed into her designer chair. The implications crashed over her like a tsunami. Every harassment complaint, every intimidation tactic, every attempt to force Samuel off his land, it was all going to be scrutinized by people with the power to destroy not just her HOA position, but her entire life. "What do we do?" she whispered into the phone. Carlyle's bitter laugh echoed through the speaker. "We? There is no we anymore, Margaret. You're on your own." The line went dead, leaving Margaret alone with the growing certainty that she'd just made the biggest mistake of her life. Outside her window, General Washington was now speaking with the news crews, his words carrying the weight of military authority and family honor. But the general's arrival was just the beginning. Because word was spreading through networks Margaret couldn't even imagine. Networks that connected Marine bases, federal agencies, civil rights organizations, and political power structures that reached all the way to Washington, D.C. The war for Samuel Washington's ranch was about to become a national story, and Margaret Pemberton was about to discover what happened when ordinary citizens picked a fight with the wrong family. By sunset, Willow Creek Estates had become the center of a media firestorm that stretched far beyond Texas. CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, and every major network had crews on scene. The hashtag #StandWithSamuel was trending nationally, with hundreds of thousands of social media posts supporting the elderly Marine veteran. But the real power play was happening behind closed doors. In the emergency HOA board meeting that Margaret had frantically called, the other board members sat in stunned silence as she tried to explain how their simple land acquisition strategy had exploded into a national scandal. The conference room felt like a bunker under siege, with the constant hum of news helicopters overhead serving as a grim reminder of how spectacularly their plan had backfired. "Margaret," said board member Thomas Hartley, his voice shaking with barely controlled rage, "do you understand what you've done to us? My law firm has already received 3 calls asking if we represent the HOA. 3 calls from reporters wanting to know about our involvement in harassing a veteran." "It wasn't supposed to go this far," Margaret whispered, her perfectly styled hair now disheveled from hours of stress. "It was supposed to be simple pressure tactics, a few complaints, some code violations, maybe a small fine or 2. He was supposed to just give up." Board Treasurer Janet Morrison slammed a folder on the table. "Give up? Margaret, the man is a decorated Marine whose nephew is a general. His daughter is one of the most successful civil rights attorneys in the country. His son is a federal judge. How did none of this come up in your research?" "I didn't think I needed to research him," Margaret snapped back. "He's just an old man living alone on a ranch." "An old man who apparently has the kind of family connections that could bury us all," Hartley muttered, scrolling through his phone. "The State Attorney General's office just announced they're opening an investigation into our HOA practices. The FBI is asking questions about potential civil rights violations, and according to my sources, there are federal agencies looking into Carlisle Development Corporation's land acquisition methods." Meanwhile, at the ranch, a very different kind of meeting was taking place. General Washington sat across from his uncle on the front porch, sharing a quiet moment away from the cameras and commotion. The Marines had established a respectful perimeter, giving the family space while maintaining their protective presence. "You know this is bigger than just your ranch now," the general said softly. "This story is going to inspire every veteran, every elderly person, every family that's ever been bullied by developers or HOAs. You've become a symbol, Uncle Sam." Samuel nodded slowly, his weathered hands folded in his lap. "I never wanted to be a symbol. I just wanted to live in peace on the land my grandfather left me." "Sometimes we don't get to choose our battles," James replied. "Sometimes the battles choose us, but you're not fighting alone anymore." As if to prove his point, headlights began appearing on the horizon, not just a few cars, but a steady stream of vehicles turning onto the ranch road. Veterans from across Texas were arriving, some in uniform, others in civilian clothes, but all united by an unbreakable bond of service and brotherhood. By midnight, nearly 300 veterans had gathered on Samuel's property. They came from all branches of service, all eras of conflict, all walks of life. Vietnam vets stood shoulder to shoulder with Iraq and Afghanistan veterans. Retired generals chatted with former enlisted men. The artificial barriers of rank and time dissolved in the face of their shared mission, protecting one of their own. The sight was overwhelming for the news crews, who struggled to capture the scope of what was unfolding. This wasn't just a property dispute anymore. It had become a demonstration of veteran solidarity, unlike anything seen in decades. Margaret Pemberton watched the growing crowd from her darkened living room, feeling like a prisoner in her own home. Her phone had been buzzing constantly with calls from reporters, lawyers, and increasingly hostile messages from neighbors who were beginning to understand the magnitude of the situation she'd created. When her doorbell rang at 1 a.m., she knew her time had run out. Opening the door revealed 2 FBI agents, their credentials gleaming under her porch light. Behind them stood Amanda Washington Hayes, Samuel's daughter, her presence radiating the kind of quiet authority that came from years of fighting injustice in courtrooms across the country. "Mrs. Pemberton," Agent Rodriguez said calmly, "we'd like to ask you some questions about your HOA's activities regarding Mr. Samuel Washington. You have the right to remain silent." As the Miranda warning echoed through her foyer, Margaret felt her carefully constructed world crumbling around her. The land grab that was supposed to make her development company millions was instead going to cost her everything. But the final blow came not from the FBI, not from the lawyers, not even from the media circus outside. It came in the form of a simple phone call at 2 a.m. "Margaret?" The voice belonged to her own son, Derek, who had helped cut the fence that started this entire disaster. "Mom, you need to turn on the news now." With trembling hands, Margaret reached for her remote. On the screen, a CNN anchor was speaking over footage of the ranch, now illuminated by hundreds of vehicles and campfires as veterans maintained their vigil. "In a stunning development," the anchor reported, "it has been revealed that the fence-cutting incident that sparked this national story was captured on security cameras installed by Mr. Washington after months of harassment. The FBI has confirmed that charges are being filed against multiple individuals in connection with the destruction of private property and potential civil rights violations." The screen switched to crystal-clear night vision footage of Derek and 2 HOA security guards cutting through the fence. Margaret watched in horror as her son's face was clearly visible in the frame, his actions documented in perfect detail. The anchor continued, "The Washington family has announced they will be donating a portion of their ranch to create a veterans retreat center, ensuring this land remains a place of healing and honor for generations to come." Margaret sank into her chair, the remote falling from nerveless fingers. She had lost everything. Her position, her reputation, her freedom, and quite possibly her relationship with her son. All because she had underestimated an elderly Marine who refused to surrender the land his family had called home for 70 years. Outside, as dawn broke over Texas, 300 veterans stood ready to defend what was right. They had answered the call, just as Marines always did. And Samuel Washington, surrounded by his brothers and sisters in arms, finally knew that his ranch and his legacy were safe. 6 months later, Samuel Washington sat on his front porch in the golden light of a Texas sunset, watching as construction crews put the finishing touches on the Samuel Washington Veterans Retreat Center. The sound of hammers and saws had replaced the harassment and intimidation that once plagued his peaceful ranch. The transformation had been remarkable. Where Margaret Pemberton had once seen only dollar signs and development opportunities, architects and planners now saw healing spaces for veterans struggling with PTSD, job training facilities for those transitioning back to civilian life, and peaceful gardens where warriors could find the solace they'd earned through their service. The HOA had been dissolved entirely, its leadership facing federal charges that would keep them in legal battles for years. Carlisle Development Corporation had filed for bankruptcy, its predatory practices exposed to national scrutiny. But perhaps most importantly, Samuel's story had inspired veterans across the country to stand up for themselves and each other. General Washington visited regularly, often bringing other military leaders who wanted to see firsthand how a community had rallied around one of their own. On this particular evening, he sat beside his uncle, both men content to watch the sun paint the sky in shades of honor and remembrance. "Any regrets, Uncle Sam?" the general asked quietly. Samuel considered the question carefully. His peaceful retirement had been shattered, his privacy invaded, his quiet life turned into a national symbol. He'd been forced to relive the harassment and fear of those dark months when it seemed like powerful forces were aligned against him. But then he looked out over his land. Truly his land now, protected by legal precedents and public attention that would make any future harassment impossible. He saw veterans working together, healing Tuga, there, finding purpose in service to others even after their military careers had ended. "No regrets," he said finally. "Sometimes a man has to stand for something bigger than himself." A dusty pickup truck pulled into the driveway, and Samuel smiled as he recognized the driver. Sergeant Maria Santos had taken early retirement from her civilian job to become the retreat center's first director. Her organizational skills and natural leadership had been instrumental in turning the dream into reality. "Evening, sir," she called out as she approached the porch. "Just wanted to let you know we've got our first group arriving Monday. 12 Marines from the 3rd Battalion, all struggling with readjustment issues." Samuel nodded, his eyes bright with purpose. "They'll find what they need here: peace, brotherhood, and the time to heal." As Santos headed inside to finalize preparations, General Washington stood to leave. "The Medal of Freedom ceremony is next month," he reminded his uncle. "The President specifically requested to meet you." Samuel chuckled. "Never thought I'd go from being harassed by an HOA to having dinner at the White House. Life takes some interesting turns." After his nephew departed, Samuel remained on the porch as darkness settled over the ranch. In the distance, he could see the lights of what had once been Willow Creek Estates. The luxury development still existed, but its character had changed completely. New residents moved in monthly, many of them veterans drawn by the story and the community that had formed around the retreat center. The original residents who had supported the HOA's harassment campaign had mostly fled, selling their homes at significant losses to escape the ongoing media attention and legal scrutiny. Justice, Samuel reflected, sometimes came in unexpected forms. His phone buzzed with a text message from his granddaughter in California. "Saw the news story about the retreat center on NBC, Grandpa. So proud of you. Mum says you're still the toughest Marine in the family." Samuel smiled, typing back slowly with weathered fingers. "Semper Fi, sweetheart. See you at Christmas." As he prepared to wheel himself inside, Samuel paused for one last look at the fence line where this whole saga had begun. The new fence was stronger than the original, built by Marine engineers with materials donated by veterans organizations across the country. But more than that, it had become a symbol of something unbreakable: the bond between those who had served and their commitment to protecting each other. A gentle breeze rustled through the oak trees where his wife was buried, and for a moment Samuel could swear he heard her voice whispering words of pride and approval. She had always believed in standing up for what was right, no matter the cost. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new veterans seeking healing, new opportunities to serve even in his twilight years. But Tony, Tate, Samuel Washington, Marine, rancher, grandfather, symbol of resistance against injustice, simply sat in the peace he had fought so hard to preserve. In the end, they had tried to take his land. Instead, they had given him a legacy that would outlast them all.